Or
all right. Good morning. All right. I don't remember the last time I gave a shir in the second slot. It's been a while. But it's happened. Be that as it may, I just want to take advantage of the fact I'm going to be giving shir this week and giving shir next week. So I thought I'll give a mini series on two counts as a series of any kind, but to talk about issues that deal with the period of Ben Mitzrayim. And since next week is Shavas Tammuz itself, I'll have to drink my coffee before I get here. So I figured I'd talk about Shavas Tammuz specifically. Also, we'll see the night of Shavas Tammuz. Right? I thought originally of giving the shir next week on Shavas Tammuz, but I said no, it would be too late to talk about it because I want to talk about the Shavas Tammuz Eve. Is that part of Shivas Tammuz, or does it only begin with the fast in the morning? Okay, so we'll talk about that. And then next week we'll talk about some of the halachot of the 3-week period or 9-day period, unless, of course, all of it has been canceled by then. So then I'll have to think of a new topic. Be that as it may.
You can talk about the cancellation.
I'll talk about the cancellation, which is the first pasuk. The first pasuk here on the sheet. The Navi, right? When we talk about these fasts, right? And they have that terminology that's attached to them, the minor fasts. Okay? So where does that come from? I mean, the idea that they are considered to be minor, right, as opposed to major. And from the pasuk, it doesn't seem like there's any difference. But pasuk, so these are, at least in their makor, and we'll talk more about this, in their source, we are talking about days that are rooted in the Nevi'im themselves. What we'll call them divrei Kabbalah. When we think about it in general, and this is true, when we talk about holidays, Moadim, the first rabbinic or non-Torah festival is, of course, Purim. Right, but which is mentioned in the Megillah. Until that point, and we've spoken a little bit about this when we've given shiurim about Purim. There's a question that comes up halachically, and which is hinted at in Psukim in the end of the Megillah. How do we create and celebrate a new holiday which is not found in the Torah? However, at the same period of time, and maybe it's not a coincidence that it's occurring at the same period of time, there are fast days that are mentioned explicitly in the Nevi'im, and these are days which have been, which are established post-Torah. So we have already a concept of customs or halachot, however you want to look at it, that do not have their roots in the Torah, but rather in later, what we would use anachronistically call later poskim. Right? But here in terms of the Nevi'im, and this is not we'll see references to this, but this is a larger topic that I can't get into right now. Is there a difference between what are you, to use the terminology that the Chazal, you call them, divrei Kabbalah, those things that are learned from the Mesorah of Nevi'im, that's what the Divrei Kabbalah, or as opposed to Rabbanan. Do I just look at it as sort of cut from the same cloth? There is up to Moshe Rabbeinu, and even that might be can make a finer distinction, but we'll leave it at that at the moment. To say, okay, this is the Torah, and this is post-Torah. Or do I look at it and I say, no, there are different periods. Things that come from the Nevi'im have more authority than later rabbinic ideas, but less authority than the Torah itself. Okay? I'm sorry?
It's really historically, you're determined by your...
Correct, but and I'd say from a religious perspective, since if it's found in the Nevi'im, and this might differentiate between, let's say, even in even if it's in the Tanakh itself, but something different between the pasuk here in Zechariah, as opposed to the Megillah. No, the Megillat Esther, part of Ketuvim, there isn't necessarily any prophetic vision that's involved with it, as opposed to the words of the Nevi'im of Zechariah, which is prophecy, and therefore the prophetic law, if you will, is going to have more clout than the non-prophetic law. Okay, as I said, that's sort of lurking in the background. Be that as it may, here we have the pasuk, and the pasuk says, "Ko amar Hashem tzvakot, tzom harivi'i, v'tzom hachamishi, v'tzom hashvi'i, v'tzom ha'asiri." So the fast day of the 4th month, namely Tammuz, the fast day of the 5th month, namely Av, the fast day of the 7th month, Tishrei, and the fast day of the 10th month, Tevet, Yiyeh Leveit Yehuda will be for the house of Judah, Sason u'lesimcha, for joy and for merriment, u'lemoadim tovim, and as a good and happy holiday. V'ha'emet v'ha'shalom ehavo, and truth and peace shall be beloved, or perhaps they will love truth and peace. So what do you see from here? Zechariah, who is now writing at the end of the period of Galut Bavel, so he is referring to 4 fast days that already are established, and those fast days, he says, will be turned into holidays at some future time. Yiyeh Leveit Yehuda. Perhaps that time is upon us right now. Not now in today, but when he's speaking, because this is as the first the second Beit Hamikdash is being consecrated, and so now from this point on, these days should be marked not as fast days, but rather as holidays. Okay, so that's the idea. So of course the Tzom Revi'i is what we call Shivasar B'Tammuz. In the time of for the Bayit Rishon, and it's also, there are a lot of larger topics that are sort of on the side here, but in the background. So it was not on Yud Zayin Tammuz, but on Tet Tammuz. It was the day which marks the breaking of the walls, so that and the beginning of the end, as it were, once the enemy is able to get within the defenses, behind the defenses of the city. So that is Tet Tammuz, was the 9th of Tammuz for the Babylonians, and the 17th of Tammuz for the Romans. I'll mention again another something lurking in the background. The dates are not mentioned; the months are mentioned. So there are those who want to argue, and this might have relevance for what we will talk about, that this is something that the Minchat Chinuch writes about at length, that there was never necessarily an edict with regard to a specific day, but rather that at some point in that month there should be a fast day signifying whatever tragedy is being commemorated at that time. The Tzom HaChamishi is, of course, Tisha B'Av, and this is both on the 9th of Av and in both of the cases of Beit HaMikdash. This also explains the discussion with regard to the 9th of Av, what I just said previously, because the Gemara says that perhaps the 10th of Av should be the date that we commemorate, not the 9th of Av, because the bulk of the burning of the Beit HaMikdash, at least in the second Beit HaMikdash, took place on the 10th of Av and not on the 9th of Av. The fire was set just as the 9th was ending and the 10th was beginning. And the Gemara says, no, we decide that when it began, that is what we're going to commemorate. But the very fact that there's the discussion, in other words, that you can move Tisha B'Av to Asara B'Av, in theory, that also seems to indicate that it's that the core is not necessarily based on any given day. Tzom Hashvi'i is Tzom Gedalia, okay, without getting into the details now, but that is the end of the end. Okay, namely that with the assassination, and also didn't, according to most sources, didn't take place on the 3rd of Tishrei, but rather on Rosh Hashanah itself. Okay, not totally clear in the Nevi'im, but there's a Mesorah, which makes sense because it was a holiday meal where he was assassinated. And so it would make sense that it would be on Rosh Hashanah, but that we push it off because we can't fast on Rosh Hashanah itself. So again, we have this idea, but that marked the end of the any Jewish settlement in the land of Israel until the return during the Persian period. And finally, Tzomash Asiri, which is Asara B'Tevet. So which was the beginning of not the beginning of the end, but we'll say the end of the beginning. Right? At that point, when there was the siege of was laid more than a year and a half before the destruction itself. So here, the order that's being that of the day is based on the months. It's not based on the order of the events. The events, the 10th would precede the 4th, and then the 5th, and then the 7th. But that is the idea, and these will be holidays. Now, we'll just point out, and we'll come back to this in a moment, that in the previous parak in Zechariah, so the Navi relates the following incident. Vayishlach Beit El Sharetzev v'regem melech v'anashav l'chalot et pnei Hashem. So this group of people come to the Navi to Beit El, leimor el kohanim asher leveit Hashem tzvakot ve'el Naviim leimor. So this was the question. Ha'efke b'chodesh ha'chamishi hinazer ka'asher asiti zeh kama shanim. This is the end of the galut, and the Beit HaMikdash is not quite yet consecrated. Now's not the time to get into the difficulties that are going on, but it's clear that this is now the end of that period of the Babylonian exile, and now it is the beginning of the new age of the second Beit HaMikdash. We have been crying in the 5th month, on Tisha B'Av. We've been crying for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Should we continue now? And the answer is, Vayid v'Hashem tzvakot elai lemor. It's somewhat oblique. Emor kol ha'am ha'aretz v'lakohanim lemor kitzabtem b'safod b'chamishi u'v'shvi'i. You have fasted in the 5th and the 7th, and now I don't have time to. Why doesn't he mention the 4th? Why doesn't he mention the 10th? But you have fasted in the 5th and the 7th. Zeh shivim shana. Hatzom tzamtuni ani. Did I tell you to fast? V'chi tochlu v'chi tishtu. Am I telling you now to eat and to drink? Atem ha'ochlim v'atem ha'shotim. You're the ones who will eat, and you will be the ones who drink. It's very enigmatic type of phrase, and here the explanation that's given by many of the Mefarshim. I just brought the Radak. Tzamtem tzamtuni. So it says the tzamtem oti kolomar im tzamtem ba'avuri ba'avur avonotechem chavar habayit v'galitem ba'avur zet tzamtem im ta'asu mishpat u'tzedakah ein atem tzrichim l'tzum. You have fasted not to commemorate an event. You have fasted to commemorate a responsibility and a culpability. And if you're able to turn the tables, if you're able to change the historical reality, and now to be living in a period not of destruction, but of rebuilding, because of your actions, so then there isn't the need anymore. That's why he's saying, I didn't declare that this is a day that is going to be bound in history, bound in time forever, that you're going to have to fast. You took it as a fast day, correctly so, to recognize your sins, and now things have changed. Right? That might also be very important, because that can now explain what the idea of Yehuda l'sason u'l'simcha u'moadim tovim in the next parak. Right? Because what we're saying is, it's a question like, could if you're commemorating the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and we talk about and we'll see this again in just a moment. Tisha B'Av has many, as we all know, many terrible tragedies have befallen the Jewish people on Tisha B'Av, starting with the Meraglim, to Batei HaMikdash, the destruction of Beitar and the Hadrianic persecutions, the fifth in the Mishnah is the plowing over of the city, which is what Hadrian did, and you can see the remnant of it in the Ir Atikah. If you go to the broad wall where it's just was filled in. It basically means it was leveled out and the city was totally razed to the ground. That is the, if you will, until the time of Mishnah, and you can add many things that have happened since. Perhaps most famously, the Spanish expulsion, which took place on Tisha B'Av. Gerush Gush Katif, not as, without getting into politics, still not on the same level. However, the beginning of World War I, which in effect was the beginning of World War II, also took place on Tisha B'Av. Was not the assassination of the Duke, but the entry of Germany into the war, which turned it into World War I, took place on Tisha B'Av. Right. So basically, if you're looking back historically, the seeds of the destruction of European Jewry started on Tisha B'Av as well. So to say now all of that, okay, holiday, sason v'simcha, right? So if you're looking at it from a historical perspective, so then it doesn't make sense. But if you're looking at it as saying, okay, this is now a question of of us being in a different place, right? Not just simply that we have a Beit HaMikdash, right? If you could say such a thing as simply, but not simply that our historical circumstances, but our national and moral and religious, spiritual circumstances have changed fundamentally. So then you can perhaps begin to understand that concept. Okay. That's sort of like a background, and then so that here we have, when we talk about Shiva Asar Tammuz, the minor fast, it is grounded together with Tisha B'Av in the pasuk already in the time of the Nevi'im. So these are things that we should be taking seriously. It shouldn't be such a minor fast; it's a major fast. All right. So now let's take a look at the way that Chazal dealt with it. The Mishnah here in source number 4, the Mishnah says the following. It comes. The Gemara gets to it, sort of through, not surprisingly, because that's what Gemaras do, through the back door. So here we go. Al Shisha Chadashim Hashluchin Yotzin. The beginning of Masechet Rosh Hashanah deals with the new moon of each month being declared by Beit Din. So when the new moon was declared by Beit Din, so 6 months out of the year, Beit Din would send messengers out that month to let people know which of the 2 possible days had been made Rosh Chodesh. Why? Al Nisan mipnei Pesach. Okay, the Nisan, in order for people to be aware that, okay, 14th day you have to bring your Korban Pesach, and then you're going to have Chag Batzot. Excuse me. Al Av mipnei HaTa'anit, on Tisha B'Av. On Av, in order to let people know that there's going to be Tisha B'Av. Al Elul mipnei Rosh Hashanah. Okay, Elul, so that way people can calculate. Because generally speaking, even though it's possible to make it a 30-day month, generally speaking, Elul was always a 29-day month, and therefore, if I knew when Rosh Chodesh Elul was, I would know, we'll say, 99 times out of 100 when Rosh Hashanah would be the following month. Al Tishrei mipnei takanat hamoadot. Nevertheless, they would send it again on right after Rosh Hashanah to let people know when Sukkot would be. Al Kislev mipnei Chanukah, and then Adar mipnei Purim. Okay, so all of these different holidays. Ukshahaya Beit Hamikdash Kayam. And when the Beit HaMikdash was still standing, Yotzin Afal Iyar Mipnei Pesach Katan. Okay, in other words, they would also send it out in the Iyar to let people know when Pesach Sheni would be. So you read this Mishnah, so you would assume that this Mishnah is referring to post-temple, post-destruction Beit Mikdash. They're still dedicating the Rosh Chodesh in the Sanhedrin. They're still sending out messengers, and they're saying, okay, you have Tisha B'Av, and when there was the time of the Iyar, right, of the Beit Mikdash, they also would send it out for Pesach Sheni. Okay, the Gemara asked the following question: V'lipku nami Tammuz v'tevet. Why didn't they go out on Rosh Chodesh Tammuz and Rosh Chodesh Tevet? Because after all, we need to know when Shavuot Tammuz is. We need to know when Asar B'Tevet is. So the Gemara says, the Amar of Chana bar Bizna Amar Bishimon Chasida. So my dichtiv. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk that we started this year with. Ko Amar Hashem Tzvakot Tzoma Revi Tzoma Kamishit Tzoma Shvi Tzoma Asiri Yelavet Yehuda L'Sason Simcha. Now let's take a look at the pasuk. Kari luhu tzom, the kari luhu sason v'simcha. The pasuk calls it Yom Tzom, right? The Tzom Revi'i, Tzom Chamishin, Tzom Shvi'i, Yelavet Yehuda L'Sason U'Simcha L'Modim Tovim. So it's sort of the way that it's understanding, and perhaps that touches upon what I said before. It was, if you're not just simply making the switch from it was a day of tragedy, and now it will become a day of rejoicing. But rather, the Gemara is saying it's really already while you are fasting, it's also a day of rejoicing. And when we will rejoice, Bezrat Hashem, it will still retain some quality of its original tragic beginnings. Right? It's sort of this push me, pull you type of day. It has both of these. If you think about it a little bit, Pesach also has that, right? We also incorporate themes of slavery into our celebration. We don't just look back and say, okay, we leave Egypt behind, but we still eat the maror. Right, so at the same time, right, it's going to be a holiday, but it's also a Yom Tzom. It's also all together. So how do we square that circle? Bizman sheyesh shalom yiyu l'sason u'l'simcha. When there is peace, then it will be a time of rejoicing. Ein shalom, tzom. If there's no peace, so then it is a day for fasting. And then the Gemara continues. Next paragraph. Amar Papa, Hachi Ka'amar. And this is what that cryptic statement can mean. Bizman sheyesh shalom, yiyu l'sason u'l'simcha. When there's peace, it's joyful. Yesh shmad, if there is persecution, tzom. Ein shmad ve'ein shalom. What if it's a time where it's not exactly peace, and nor is it a time of persecution? Ratzu mitadin, ratzu ein mitanin. If they want, right, you can fast, they can fast, and if they don't want, they don't fast. So the Gemara says, now, we haven't defined our terms, by the way, and the Gemara will not define its terms. Right? We are going to have to try to define terms a little bit. What is peace? What is persecution? What is neither? Okay? So we'll hold on. We'll get to there. But the Gemara asks the following question. Ihachi Tisha B'Av Nami. In other words, what does the Gemara say? It seems as though, first of all, when the Gemara was asking the question, they were fasting. That's why they said, well, why don't you send out the messengers? And they say, no, it's implying that it's optional. Ratzu, lo ratzu. And therefore, since it's optional, we don't send out messengers specifically to let the people know. Okay, but if that's the case, and why is that? Because there's no peace and no shmad, that's the optional time. Got it? What about Tisha B'Av? The Mishnah said you send it out for Tisha B'Av. The pasuk talks about all the fasts in one fell swoop. Why is Tisha B'Av any different than the other three? So the Gemara answers, Ihachi Tisha B'Av Nami. The Gemara answers, Amar Papa, the same Rav Papa, Shani Tisha B'Av, Ho'il v'huchpelu botzara. Tisha B'Av is different because the troubles have been doubled. Double trouble. right? Huchbal, kefel, and tzarot trouble, right? So it's double trouble. The Amar b'tisha b'av charav habayit barishona uv'shniya v'nilkada beita v'nechrasha ha'ir. The four tragedies without getting to the Meraglib. Simply, you have these so many terrible things have happened on Tisha B'Av that it never was Ratzu Lo Ratzu. It was always everyone did it. Now, the question that has to be asked is, we'll still try to figure out what time are we talking about, what period of time are we speaking about, but also, so now we said Tisha B'Av is they were fasting. Is that also because of Ratzu, V'lo Ratzu? In other words, it sort of was that Tisha B'Av, you have to fast. So is Tisha B'Av you have to fast, so qualitatively it's different than the others? Or is Tisha B'Av you have to fast because we all want to fast on Tisha B'Av? Because we all understand the significance of Tisha B'Av. So of course we're going to fast on Tisha B'Av. If we all felt the same way about Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, it would also be that. But we don't feel that way about Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Right? But so, in other words, qualitatively, legally, it's really, Tisha B'Av is no different than the others. It's just that in practice, at that time, everyone fasted on Tisha B'Av, and not everyone would fast necessarily on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Or, no, we're saying that since Tisha B'Av is just so terrible, it goes back to, if you will, prophetic law. That is Kabbalah, that of course you have to fast on Tisha B'Av, and this whole Ratzu, Lo Ratzu stuff, that's only with regard to the other three. In other words, that so from a qualitative perspective and a legal perspective, Tisha B'Av is different than the others. Okay, those are the two possibilities. We'll see what comes up.
In the second Beit HaMikdash, they didn't fast in Tisha B'Av.
That's the question. Well, let's get to that. Thank you very much for that segue. So here let's try to define some terms, because the Gemara here, right, is really speaking very, very, I wouldn't say in tongues, but it's certainly speaking cryptically. It's really difficult to understand what our terms are and what period of time are we talking about and all these things that are going on. So we look at Rashi. What does Rashi say? Rashi says, the Amar Rabbi Chamer Bar Bizna, that he was the one who, the first who introduced this concept of the same day having different significance depending on the circumstances at that particular time. Dekuli yemei tanit ninhu bizman hazeh she'ein Beit HaMikdash kayam. Was our Mishnah and our Gemara is referring to the current historical reality when the Beit HaMikdash is no longer built in our midst. And as a result, matnitin bizman hazeh kamare midiktani uksha mikdash kayam. In other words, the Mishnah is very clearly speaking about post-Churban times, because the Mishnah said when the Beit HaMikdash was standing, this is what they did. So that means that right now the Beit HaMikdash is not standing. So Rashi says, everything about our Mishnah is talking about post-Churban times. And so, therefore, there is clearly a Tisha B'Av. Presumably, there was no Tisha B'Av when the Beit HaMikdash was standing. But there is Tisha B'Av now it's mandatory. And the other fasts, we'll say, are optional. Okay, Ratzu, Lo Ratzu. So what is Sheyesh Shalom, if that's the case? So Rashi says something which is a little strange. She'ein yad ha'ovdei kochavim tkefa al Yisrael. When you have political independence. Whereas Rashi implies, and other people sort of want to step back on Rashi on this one, that basically if you were to have a situation like today, perhaps, right, where you have, without getting into a political discussion, where you have an independent Jewish state, Ein yad ovdei kochavim tkefa al Yisrael. The hand of the idolater, of the pagan, is not held forcefully on the Jewish people. You have independence, so that would be shalom. That's shalom. Remember, we're talking about, by definition, in post Churban times. Yiyu l'sason u'l'simcha le'aser behesped u'v'ta'anit. So what's the joy? Right? In other words, how can you have it? In other words, you're talking about without a Beit HaMikdash, so you can have peace. And what is the peace? The peace is that these are days, these would be very minor festivals. Not, we're not talking about major festivals with, we'll even say Yom HaAtzmaut. We'll say it's a day where you don't say Tachnun. Okay? Which I guess for some people makes, if it's a Monday, Thursday, that's a major festival. But the idea that you are, basically, you don't have eulogies because it's a joyful day and you're not allowed to fast. That's the extent of it. No Hallel, no, that's the Sason of Simcha. No, you see that Rashi sort of is narrowing the parameters because we're talking about post-Churban time, and you can talk about Shalom, you can talk about Shemad, which unfortunately over the subsequent centuries and millennia has probably been the majority of the time, and then you can talk about okay time, the Yad Kefa, is we live under foreign rule, but it's the golden age of Spain. So then, that's a time where it's optional. That's the way Rashi would understand it. Rabbeinu Hananel, who's an earlier in North Africa, one generation before Rashi, so in his commentary, he says the following. Uparik Rav Papa Achi Kamar Bizman Sheyeh Shalom Kilomar Kol Zman Shebeit HaMikdash Kayam Yeh L'Sason L'Simcha. Right, and there, as I said, I don't want to get into how to fit it into Rashi, but basically he says no. What is Shalom? He doesn't. People say that this is what Rashi really meant. Also, couldn't be that if you don't have a Beit HaMikdash, that's Shalom. Though it sounds from Rashi that it is, but that the Rabbeinu Hananel certainly says no. What is Shalom? When you have the Beit HaMikdash. Then it's a holiday, right? When you don't have it, so then we are at best in that middle period where it's, we're managing and it's not too terrible. And then you can have also, God forbid, a situation where you have significant persecution. So that's what they both agree, though, presumably, is that during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, there was no Tisha B'Av. Right? That during that all of this has been sort of put on hold. And by the way, that also touches back to those psukim in Perek Zayin that we read as well. It's saying that the Navi is sort of saying you decided to fast on these days, and that's a good thing, and you don't have to fast if you've done tshuva. But it means the days are still on the books. They haven't been repealed. They are there to be applied if necessary, right? So you can now, the obvious question which should be asked, we don't have anything like this, at least that I'm familiar with, where we tell people, okay, im ratzu, you can eat kitniot. Im lo ratzu, you don't eat kitniot. Whatever. Pick your halacha, any halacha. You don't have anything like that it's optional. Here we suddenly saying you have an optional fast, right? Forget about a minor fast; it's an optional fast. So then, where does that come from? So if these days already in the Nevi'im are being said as being sort of on the books, but sometimes they are applicable and sometimes they're not applicable, you can now understand why the Chachamim is sort of more formally deciding when these different periods will click in. So the Rambam has a completely different way of looking at it. Rambam says, and this is his commentary to the Mishnah, that Mishnah on Rosh Hashanah. Bayit sheni lo hayu mitanin lo asiri v'tevet lo shivasar v'tammuz ela rotzei yitaneh o shelo yitaneh. Right? During the second temple period, that was, the Rambam says, is the period of neither peace nor persecution. That's that middle period, and the minor fasts were optional. Lefikach lo hayu yotzin al tevet v'al Tammuz. and they didn't go out on Tevet and Tammuz. Amar Hashem, and he quotes the pasuk. Ki'ilu natan et bechira biyadam. It's as though, as I explained in terms of reading the psukim, God Himself is giving them the choice. Imratzu or lo. And now the last line in bold. V'hayu mitanin b'tisha b'av. The Rambam says during the second temple period they fasted and commemorated Tisha B'av. Afa pishu masur l'ritzonam. Even though it was optional to them as well. Why? Because Tisha B'av already was so terrible. Now everybody asks, what do you mean? It becomes double trouble when the second Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. What's going on during that period, the Second Temple period? Tisha B'av isn't. Nothing double has happened. I mean, there has been the Meragliv and there's been the Churban. Right? I'm not minimizing those things, but on Shivasar B'Tammuz, there was the Egel, and there was the breaking of the walls. So that also huchbalu. What's the idea? So presumably the Rambam would understand this, and this is source number 9. Tosfot asks the question with regard to even the post-temple period, since the Mishnah and Tanya talks about 5 things that happened to the 5 tragedies that occurred on Shivasar B'Tammuz as well. So they also have a lot. So the first answer is the answer which is the answer that the Rambam would, I think, give. Aval churban Beit HaMikdash tkefa tuva. The destruction of the Beit HaMikdash is much more severe. In other words, what the Rambam would say, and what Tosfot is saying here, is that it's not a question of just simply deja vu and that we're having a repeat of the same thing, but rather it's a question of the severity. So the severity of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash is greater than all of the other 3, perhaps greater than the other 3 combined. And here, so that's why Huchbal doesn't mean that it's been doubled. Huchbal means that the severity has been doubled, not necessarily the incident itself. The second answer, Va'od, that Tosfos says, is not relevant to the Rambam. He says that this is the only one. There are 5 things that happened on Shivasar B'Tammuz, 5 things that happened on Tisha B'Av, but only on Tisha B'Av did the same thing happen twice. Only on Tisha B'Av did you have the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash twice on the same day. That, of course, the Rambam couldn't answer because he's saying in the Second Temple period they were already fasting. So that's the idea. However, what about that line in the Mishnah? The proof that Rashi brought that the Mishnah was post-Churban was because it says explicitly in the Mishnah, Uvizman shebeit hamikdash kayam. Right, in the time when the Beit HaMikdash was standing, they also did it on the on Iyar. That would prove that this Mishnah can't be referring to the time of the Beit HaMikdash, and that would how did the Rambam understand it? So as it turns out, it's based on the Girsa, the text of the Mishnah. If you take a look at number 8, which I took as the Kitav Yad Kaufman, that's because it was in his collection. Kaufman, it's found in Hungary. This is considered to be the most authoritative manuscript of the Mishnah, and this is how it reads: Al shisha chodeshim shluchim yotzim. It has it, and then if you take a look at the last line in the brackets, in the square brackets. Shamikdash kayam yotzim af al iyar. Right, that word af in the brackets indicates that in that particular manuscript, it's written in the margin. Okay, basically there's a question amongst and the Rambam's text doesn't have the word af either. We have the actual Rambam's. We have a manuscript of the Rambam himself in the Rambam's signed hand of the Perush HaMishnayot, and he wrote the text of the Mishnah in the manuscript. So we know what the Rambam was looking at, and that word af doesn't appear in the Rambam's Mishnah. So it appears in our text, and there could have been 2 different traditions, or there could have been a scribal error. We don't know, but the term af is not so clear. If you take the word also out of the Mishnah, so what it's saying is that that during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, this is now post. Excuse me. During it's not always 6. It could be 7. It depends on the circumstances, right? Do you have it or not? In other words, if you we were fasting before, and during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, they also added the ER. So this is, it's all a question of whether it is. You can read the Mishnah one way or the other, but this is a machloket. What is radical about the Rambam is that he says that it's not at all based on the time of the Churban. You can have a concept of being in Bayit Sheni and it being a time not considered of peace, right? So, 1 second. What is a time of peace then, according to the Rambam? Let me just finish this idea and then I'll take any questions. And so here, the Rambam says the following. This is now not the Rambam in his explanation of the Mishnah, but rather the Rambam in terms of in the halachot. And here he gives the listing of the fast. That's halacha dalid, and he says v'nav halacha hey. The breakdown of the halachot is later. The Rambam didn't write it halacha dalid hey. That was a later editor that broke it down. So this could very well be, from the Rambam's perspective, a continuation of the previous sentence. Nagu kol Yisrael b'zmanim elu lihitanot. So there's the custom of today to fast, and now the question of whether that vav is there is very important, because if you take out the vav and you read it, v'nagu kol Yisrael b'zmanim elu lihitanot b'yugimel ba'adar zecher l'tanit sheitanu b'mei Haman shenemar. Today we have the custom to fast on Tanit Esther, which is a later custom, right? And the previous halacha is the halacha of these are Hayrehen Mefurashin B'Kabbalah, the first line of halacha Dalet. These are explicit in the Nevi'im. Right, so these have one category, and then there's another which is Nagu. However, if you have the Vav there, right, so then it's V'Nagu Kol Yisrael B'Zmanim Elu Lihitanot. In other words, why do we fast these other fasts? Because that's a minhag. And then also there's another fast, right? There is this question of whether you should be doing this or not. The consensus, the Maggid Mishnah, the primary commentator to the Rambam. Now, we're getting to run out of time, so I'm not going to go read it inside. But he had that vav, so he wanted to say that all of the previous the previous fasts, including Tisha B'av, all are cut from the cloth of ratzu or not. That since the Nagu Kol Yisrael B'Zmanim Elu Lihitanot, that is the minhag. The consensus, however, is that vav is a mistake. Right, that the quality manuscripts of the Rambam do not have the vav, and that this halacha hey is separate, and halacha dalid is talking about how these earlier fasts have their roots in the Kabbalah. Be that as it may, what is what is ratzu lo ratzu? What's going on? So let's take a look at just skipping the Makorot. We'll come back soon to the previous Makorot, to the commentary of Rav Rabinovich Zatzal to the Rambam, to the Mishnah Torah, and I'm not going to read it totally inside, but he basically wants to make the case in the following way, and it makes it very convincingly. He's not the first to make it, but he sets it out very clearly, and he says that basically that there is this political element that has to be looked at. Whereas, what is the time of shalom that we refer to? So the Rashi talks about political freedom. The consensus most of the Rishonim following Rabbeinu Hananel talk about the Beit HaMikdash standing. Certainly that's the way, I would say, in the popular type of imagination, if we talk about it, we always say the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt and da-da-da-da-da. Right? Mashiach comes, etc. That is the idea. So if you have the Beit HaMikdash, that's Shalom, and if you don't have the Beit HaMikdash, that's not Shalom, and that presumably means that during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, back the second Beit HaMikdash, they didn't fast Tisha B'Av, and everything is along those lines. Rambam, we saw, says that you do fast on Tisha B'Av during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. What is he understanding Shalom as? So he says, what is Shalom? Shalom is, what would you say? Right? The complete redemption.
Complete autonomy.
Not complete autonomy. Complete redemption. In other words, when we, Be'ezrat Hashem, will celebrate the coming of the Mashiach, and when the entire world, what we say every day, Al Kein Nekaveh, right? Every day we talk about it in B'Yerushalayim Yircha B'Rachamim Tashuv V'Tishkon B'Tocha, and everyone acknowledges it, and we have a clear messianic period. That's Shalom. Until that point, I don't care if there's a Beit HaMikdash or not. I do. But I don't care if there is or not in terms of defining it as Shalom. Right? I look at that period of those, more than 400 years of when, perhaps more than 500 years, of when there was a second Beit HaMikdash. So yes, would I like to have that? But then we also know that when it was built, we were under Persian domination. And we only had a limited independence after Hanukkah. Right? And that was pretty short-lived. Right? Less than 100 years before the Romans walked in. Right, so that is, and then we had a 150-year period of Roman domination. Right, so during that time period, even in that perhaps short sliver of independence amongst the Hashmonaim, and even there was civil war, and there was all sorts of strife. That's not Shalom. Right, we might look back at it and say, yes, we want the Beit HaMikdash. It is so important on so many different levels, but it's not Shalom. Shalom is when we have a true messianic period. That's Shalom. Lo Shalom v'lo Shmad, that is during perhaps most of the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. When you have an Antiochus, when you have a period of Herod who is persecuting the Chachamim, etc. That's Shmad, even though the Beit HaMikdash is standing. Right? So you can have the period of time of the Beit HaMikdash, and you can have it, but you can't call that Shalom. You don't have Shalom until it's all over. Right? That's Shalom. And that point in time of the Messianic period, and we will hopefully have a better perspective on what has occurred in Jewish history over the last how many ever thousands of years, then we could talk about Shalom. Until then, we can't talk about Shalom. That's the Rambam's position, which would mean, that according to the Rambam, in this period, so this period is a period of Shmad. When you don't have when you don't have a Beit HaMikdash, that's the Shmad. So, which would mean that today it's not optional. The whole Ratzu Lo Ratzu doesn't apply according to the Rambam, and that's why the Rambam lists the 4 fasts together in the halacha. All these fasts have the same status. All of these fasts are, whether it's Tisha B'Av or Shivas or Tammuz, are Divrei Kabbalah, and this is what you need to do. Now, that's the Rambam. That's perhaps, if you will say, in this corner. What about everybody else? Everybody else says during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, that's the time of peace. Post you can perhaps, we'll talk about dominant, we'll leave Rashi aside. During our time, you can't talk about peace. You can talk about persecution, right? During a time of which would imply that, let's say, God forbid, during a time like the Shoah, right? So then you don't have an option to be fasting. And then in other times, so then you have this ratzu lo ratzu. Okay, it is optional. Now, is it optional for me? Is it optional for you? Is it optional for groups of people? How does that work? So this seems to have been a machloket. If you take a look at number 12, a tshuva of the Gaonim. I'm not sure exactly which Gaon, so I can't tell you exactly which century it is, but it's the time of the Gaonim. Sha'altem arbat somot batlu. You ask about, have the 4 fasts been cancelled? Hilkach shloshat somot mi she'eno rotze latsum ein bekach klum ve'ein mechayev behem eno mechuyav behem. So here we have a text saying that in the time of the Gaonim, the assumption was that the Gaonim were saying, at least one of the Gaonim was saying, that you can decide, do you want to fast on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, do you not want to fast on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz? Right? So you have to do that. That's the idea. The Ramban takes another tack, and most he's speaking about other people who have this opinion as well that predated the Ramban. The Ramban was at the end of the 13th century. The Ramban says, the mid-13th century, excuse me. The Ramban says, Ein shalom kimo bizban churban, ve'ein sarah yadua b'Yisrael. So what is, the moment that there's a churban, it's not peace anymore. However, the persecutions are not that you don't know of any persecutions per se. So then, Ratzu Rov Yisrael v'niskimu shelo lihitanot ein matrichin aleihem. In other words, if you have a period of time where there isn't any overt persecution, so then if the majority of the Jewish people, it's not an individual decision, it's a communal decision. And if the majority of communities decide that we don't need to fast right now, then we don't force them to fast. But if the majority of the community wants to fast, mitanin. Okay, now there are those who want to point out that he said Ratzu Rov Yisrael and then Rov Tzibur. It's not exactly the same thing. And the idea being that to not fast at all, that you need sort of this consensus amongst the Jewish people. If that's not, by the way, time of shalom, when you get a consensus amongst Jewish people, I don't know what is. Anyway, but you have a consensus, okay? But in order to fast in a given community, in other words, even if everyone's saying, okay, basically Jews aren't fasting during this time. But one community, Rov Tzibur, says, we're still living in Spain, we're still living in Morocco, wherever we are, and really we should fast, right? We shouldn't be so sanguine about Jewish existence right now. They're allowed to. That's Rov Tzibur, right? It's to accept it upon yourself. You can have a communal decision, but to get rid of the whole thing, that requires a national consensus. But now the Ramban says, that's all theoretical. He says, but what goes on today, Ramban writing in Barcelona of the 13th century, Achshav kvar ratzu v'nahagu lihitanot. V'kiblu aleihem, and however, it has become the accepted practice to fast. And everyone has accepted this upon themselves. Lefikach asur liyachid lifrotz geder. So at this point, you don't have the option. As opposed to what the Gaonim said, that it was something which was an individual decision, Ramban says no. But then he says beyond that, v'chol shechein b'darot halalu, and all the more so in our generations, shaharei ba'avonotenu sherabu tzarot b'Yisrael ve'ein shalom. The Ramban is writing in the Crusader period. So even though he's not directly impacted by the Crusades because he's in Spain, but he has to actually himself flee Spain because of the famous disputation that he had with regard to the debate with regard to the Talmud. And there is not yet forced conversion in Spain, but there is very heavy pressure by the church for Jews to be converted. In fact, his disputant in that debate was an apostate. Ve'ein shalom hilkach chayavina kol itanot midivrei Kabbalah v'takanat neviim. So the Ramban says today Shivasar b'Tammuz has the same legal impact as does Tisha B'Av itself. ומסתבר דכולו ארבע צומות תענית ציבוריהם ונביאים גזרו אותם וכל חומרי תעניות עליהן מפסיקים בהן מבעוד יום ואסורים ברחיצה ושיחה ונעילת הסדל ותשמיש המיטה כתשעה באב. In other words, the Ramban says you should be logically consistent here. If you're saying that it's a question of whether you want to or not, and this is going to be something that I haven't spoken about. In terms of the acceptance of the date, the Gemara said Ratzu, Lo Ratzu. What about we all are familiar, why do we call it the minor fasts? Because they start in the morning, they don't start at night. And because the other four the restrictions don't apply on the fast day. Right? So that's why they're the minor fast, because they're not as oppressive in terms of the practice. The Ramban says there should be the snapback clause in the sanctions. That's basically what's happening, right? It's the moment that you decide this is a time of persecution, so now Shavasar b'Tammuz becomes Tisha B'Av, and you should start it at night. And everything that is forbidden to you should apply. We don't do that, right? And presumably, Jews didn't do it. That's only presumably. Take a look at number 14. You'll see that the Mishnah Berurah says, based on this Ramban, and this Ramban is brought in the Tur and subsequent poskim, says mutarim berechitza. So on the halacha that you're allowed to bathe on the minor fast. So he explains the b'sha'ah. So two very important things come from this. One is the b'sha'ah sheratzu v'kiblu aleihem latzum b'chol arba taniyot hanal lo kiblu aleihem shiyu b'chomer tanit tzibur k'tisha b'av. Sorry that I didn't open up the abbreviations. Lefi she'ein rov hatzibur yecholin la'amod ba ubal nefesh yachmir b'chulan kemo b'tisha b'av. So he says in two things. This is the second one is the easier one. The second line, the Baal Nefesh, that means the person who's religiously sensitive should treat it as though it's Tisha B'Av. Right, so if a person were to say, I think that it's appropriate in this historical time period to be treating this as Tisha B'Av, so then that is something which is legitimate. Right? He's not just being machmir. He's saying he's showing a certain sensitivity, and he's saying that these four fasts are there, and they have all of these different clauses and different times, etc., different levels of severity. This is a period of time that, thank God I don't think we live in that time now. But if we were to say 80 years ago, during the more than 80 years ago already, but 85 years ago during the Shoah, someone were to say this is a time where we should be fasting that would be perfectly legitimate. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says in the second. But the first line, right, is also equally important, and that answers why the Ramban is not accepted lahalacha. What the Ramban argues is there's the snapback clause to the sanctions, right? You reach that point. But the Mishnah Berurah just said, and this is based on other people who wrote this before him, is that basically Ratzu lo Ratzu doesn't only apply to which days or when I'm going to do it. It's also to what level of severity will I keep. And so the Ratzu lo Ratzu, when they decided, meaning the collective Jewish entity over the centuries, decided that these were going to be minor fasts, that was the level of severity that they gave to it. Even if in terms of keeping the fast, you don't have a choice. In other words, we say during the time of Shmad, everybody has to fast. But even during the time of Shmad, we recognize that it's still not quite Tisha B'Av, and therefore you don't have to start your fast at night. You don't have to accept the other restrictions. The idea of the Baal Nefesh, person who's more spiritually attuned, we'll say, more spiritually sensitive, so then that person can do it. Right? He can, if you will, follow the Ramban's approach, but the halacha, even in the worst of times, never accepted that. The halacha understood that the collective sensibilities of the Jewish people did not accept that level of severity for these fasts. So it could be that the authority goes back to the time of the Nevi'im, but the level of observance, that is going to be different between the fast days, the 3 minor fasts, and Tisha B'Av. Okay, so we're going to stop here because my time is up. We'll continue on this theme. You can hold on. I'll put the subsequent Makorot on the next sheet as an introduction for the next topic. So I'll take advantage of this being a series that we'll be able to continue it next week in Mirtzeh Hashem.
So